Okay, welcome. I think we'll get started. We'll kick things off, and people may join us in the next couple of minutes as well. A hugely warm welcome from the Equal Media and Culture Centre for Scotland at Ingender. My name is Miranda. I'm the project manager for the centre, which aims to promote cultural, social and economic parity across Scotland's media, creative and cultural landscape. And it does this through partnerships with many of the people here today, research, monitoring and advocacy. So I'm really delighted to welcome you all for this event on diversity, media and narrative power. We're really glad to be co-hosting this event with the Association of Journalism Education, which was founded in 1997 and which represents journalism educators at higher education institutions in the UK and also in Ireland. We'd also like to extend our very grateful thanks to the International Magazine Centre for supporting today's event. The International Magazine Centre is the global membership organisation supporting small publishers and people working in and around magazines. We were really delighted to speak at their event, Magazine Street, in October of this year, and to be the recipients of their raffle donation. So we really look forward to working with them again in 2024. So inevitably, I'm afraid, some housekeeping at the top of today's event. The event uses Zoom webinar function, which means that you can see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. So that means you are very free to make a cup of tea, let the dog out, etc., and we will never know. Please do feel free to add questions, though, into the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the screen, for the panel discussion, which will be at the end. The webinar is a safe space. That means that we really encourage you to be free to ask questions in the Q&A and also to provide us with feedback and reflections in the Menti, which will be a little interactive section in the middle. Not too interactive, don't worry. And also we would ask that everyone remains careful and respectful of each other and all of our different experiences of the world. This event is being recorded and it's also being live captioned by the fantastic Jen. So you can click on the CC button at the bottom of the bar on Zoom to access the captions, or you can also use the stream text link that will probably be shared in the chat around about now. Please do share your thoughts on the event to our social media channels, or indeed any further questions you might have. You can email us at info@ingender.org.uk. So the purpose of the session today is to share knowledge and understanding about the importance of having diverse content, and there is so much content in the world around us. Our advertising, digital media, broadcasting, news and entertainment, books and magazines here in Scotland and indeed in the UK remain dominated by the experiences and perspectives of a privileged few. In itself, this is problematic. 76% of editors of Scotland's newspapers are white men. In 2017, 9.3% of major magazine covers in the UK featured a person of colour. Between 2000 and 2015, only 14% of directors of UK films were women, and just 1% were women of colour. Again, in 2017, only 37% of authors whose books were published in Scotland were women. So it speaks to a media and culture that many, perhaps even most, cannot easily relate to or see themselves in. But this lack of diversity becomes even more significant, even more damaging, when we look at its impact beyond the industry itself. The arts, media and culture sectors play a really vital role in shaping Scottish attitudes and values, and by extension, the stories we tell about who we are as a society. These stories inform the messages our children and young people consume about what they can do with their lives and who they can be. The same stories build narratives around who we believe, who has the right to occupy public space, including online space, whose voices we hear authority in, who we perceive to be an expert, and who is included in the fabric of our heritage as a country. We also know that if we want a Scotland free of gender-based violence, which disproportionately affects women of colour, refugee women and LGBTQ people, then we need to tackle gender inequality first. Part of which means addressing the stereotypes and the gendered roles in the content that we're consuming. Diverse participation, representation and visibility are a cornerstone of primary prevention of violence. So if the language, the imagery and the discourses that emerge in our mediated world start to consolidate into narratives that define our values as a country, then this actually presents us with an opportunity. It means that our writers, our producers, our publishers and journalists have the power to change the narratives and help shape a progressive and inclusive country that represents us all. So we want to encourage everyone here to examine our own work and our own practices really critically. When you write, are you unconsciously using gender-coded words like suggest or hope about women and demand or announce about men? When you select photos, are you thinking carefully about who is represented and what the context says about them? Are you thinking about the tropes and stereotypes that are so easy to fall back on, and yet they can be really damaging? And can we be more proactive in our seeking out and foregrounding the voices and perspectives of people who we don't usually hear from, and not just on issues of inequality? So some examples: if you're writing or covering sport, are you proactively seeking out women's fixtures? And it's 2024 nearly. Can we please stop calling it the ladies' game? If you're recruiting for new people, are you making sure to attract people from lots of different backgrounds, marginalized backgrounds, and those following non-traditional routes into the sector? If you are an educator in journalism, media or communications, are you embedding gender awareness and anti-racism into your reading lists, into your curricula, even your open days? If you're a researcher, are you taking an intersectional approach to your research, making sure to use analysis that includes the lived experiences of multiply marginalized people? If you are creating digital content, can you perhaps introduce guidelines for your organization on what posts need to be, what posts need to include or consider, including stereotypes and visual representation? And finally, if you're in a position of leadership, are you looking around you to see who's sitting in positions of power in your organization and whose voices are missing at senior levels? We know that 71% of our national creative and cultural bodies here in Scotland have no women of colour on their boards. How can you monitor this in your own institution and make change? So all of this and more is going to be covered by our amazing speakers today, and I'm personally so grateful to each of them for giving their time today to help make this session so vibrant and informative. Just a reminder for our speakers to keep to the tight timeline that we've got, and if you do run over, I will pop in to interrupt you and give you a minute to wrap up. But I'm going to shut up now. I'm delighted now to pass over to Karen Boyle. Karen is Professor of Feminist Media Studies at Strathclyde University. Her research focuses on questions of violence, gender and representation. And along with her colleague, Susan Berridge, she has co-edited the Routledge Companion to Gender, Media and Violence, which came out earlier this year. She is also the Scottish coordinator of the Global Media Monitoring Project, which is fantastic. I recommend you check it out if you don't know it already. Right, Karen, I shall pass over to you.
Thank you, Miranda, and hello, everyone. I'm going to talk us through a little bit some research in terms of where we're currently at in the UK and in Scotland specifically. And the main areas where we have quantitative evidence relate to employment and news. We've heard from Miranda already some other areas that we do know we do have some data on, particularly in terms of employment. And behind the scenes, if we look at journalism, we know now that women make up a majority of the journalism workforce in the UK. So a study of the National Council of Journalists in 2021 suggested that 53% of the journalism workforce are women. And in the UK and elsewhere, women are now a majority in journalism education. But that doesn't yet filter through to every level of the workforce. So women remain underrepresented in managerial and top executive positions and paid less than their male counterparts. Horizontal segregation also persists. So women are particularly underrepresented in beats in sectors like sports and business. On the content side, which is mostly where my work tends to lie, quantitative evidence is usually gathered by what we talk about as media monitoring. So by counting who's in the media and in what roles. And we've heard a little bit about that from Miranda already. One of the biggest studies that does this globally is the Global Media Monitoring Project, which takes a snapshot of where women appear in news media across the globe. I think the last iteration had 119 countries in it. And that's on one day every 5 years. So it allows us to compare every 5 years where we're at globally. and allows different countries to see how they compare to other countries. So the last study was conducted in 2020, and just to give you a few headline findings from that study, since 1995, which is when GMMP originated, the proportion of women appearing as news subjects or sources in newspaper, television, and radio news has increased, yay, from 17% to 25%. Maybe not so yay. What that means is that we still in a situation where only 1 in 4 people appearing in our news are women. The marginalisation of women's voices is most notable in the most valued news genres, such as political reporting. So in 2020, for instance, women made up 20% of subjects and sources in news reporting. The figures for Scotland, news reporting on politics, I should say. The stats for Scotland there were slightly better, largely because we had a female First Minister at the time, but still less than the proportion of women in our legislature. So there's a suggestion that the media is lagging behind often, even where politics has got to, and it's not exactly like politics has necessarily got to where we need it to be yet. Another thing I thought was really interesting in the 2020 study was that women's presence in science and health stories declined between 2015 and 2020. So in 2015, women were 35% of subjects and sources in science and health, and in 2020, they were 30%. Now, I think, of course, if we think about the major difference between 2015 and 2020, COVID is the major difference. And so at the very moment at which science and health starts to become a more valued and more important news topic, we start to see women's participation slip away. And that suggests something we need to be alert to and monitoring in the next iteration of the project. So that's the global picture, but I want to turn now to Scotland. And the Global Media Monitoring Project sample of Scottish media is quite small. So I want to draw here on some work I did for Pass the Mic, which is a project focused on women of colour in Scottish media, which we'll hear more about soon from Talat. And this was a project that I ran along with Talat and my colleague Melody House to look at the reporting, to look at issues to do with gender and race in the Scottish media. And the study looked at 2020 and 2021 and looked at broadcast, online and print media. So I just want to share a few key findings from that study. It may not surprise you to know that we found that white men were by far the majority as both journalists and subjects and sources. So white men were 58% of journalists, but this was much higher when we looked at those who were providing columns or opinion pieces. So 65.3% of columnists were white men. And subsequent research that one of my students undertook looking at column writing specifically in Scotland has lent weight to that point and indeed found the same. As subjects and sources, we also find that white men dominate in a way that's disproportionate to their presence in the population. So white men made up 59% of subjects and sources in the Scottish news. And if we look at people with particular functions in the news, we see that this can be even more marked. So one of the really key areas is around expertise, who's deemed to be an expert on a topic, who's brought in to share their expertise. And there we see this is even more sharply gendered, with men making up 61% of experts, and women of colour were only 2.4% of experts used in the Scottish media. One thing that was interesting, but in some ways surprising, was also the extent to which women of colour were marginalised as those representing popular opinion. So when we're looking at people who are there for their opinion, it's people, you know, vox pops, people who are drawn on to comment on an issue, but who are not themselves expert. And existing research has tended to point to this is a category where women appear in higher numbers than they do, say, in the expert category. But actually what we found, and I think is concerning for the Scottish media, is that women of colour were really underrepresented as people giving popular opinion at only 1.7%. And I think that's worrying because it suggests that we're not drawing on our full population when we're asking how the budget affects particular communities within Scotland, for instance. We also found that people of colour on the whole were much less likely to be quoted than their white counterparts. That means we weren't hearing their own words, their own analysis. But there was also a really interesting gap between being quoted and being photographed. And that gap was biggest for women of colour. So what we found was that women of colour were more likely to be seen than heard from. There were more likely to be images of women of colour accompanying a news story in which they weren't actually heard from as experts, as subjects, as sources. And this was reflected in the fact that when we looked at the occupational roles women of colour fulfilled in these stories, there was a particular emphasis on celebrity. So this idea that in a sense, women of colour were being used in some senses as window dressing on particular kinds of stories. One of the sample periods we looked at included both Strictly Come Dancing and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. And I have to say, if those two TV shows had not been running at that point, the number of women of colour in Scottish news would have sunk to an almost even more marginal level, if it's possible to imagine. So that also points to the fact that we found that women of colour in Scottish news were often in stories not about Scotland. So again, going back to that point I made earlier, are we really gathering the expertise and experience of the people who are affected by the news in our country? So I think all of this points to the fact that we've still got some way to go to create a media which reflects our population. And you're going to hear about lots of ideas on that from other people on the panel today. And I suppose I just wanted to reflect on a few ways in which I think your work, all our work, can be part of that process. Because it's not just about increasing representation, important though that is, but a key challenge for us all, I think, as well, is improving that representation. So not having that tokenistic image, but making sure that we are actually hearing from people about their experiences. So to do that, there's three things I'm going to leave you with, three questions I'd ask you to take into your media practice. And the first one, which echoes what Miranda's already said, and I'm sure what other speakers will say, is who, and therefore what, am I missing? So a key question to ask yourself is who's not here? And for some of you, that will mean drawing on your own communities, because you'll already have a really sharp sense of who's missing because your experiences in life don't match what you read about or hear in your media content. But for all of us, I think that means building our networks and sources, being aware of our own biases and the limitations of our worldview. And I think a real challenge in any sector is knowing what you don't know, or being willing to acknowledge what you don't know, and therefore where you need to bring in expertise. And I think this question of who's missing, who am I missing, is not just for fact-based content, although I've talked mainly about that today, but it's for all areas of media. It's an equally valid question to think about in relation to the programming of comedy or film festivals, or indeed of events like this one, as well as putting together news stories. So that's my first question, who am I missing? My second question, perhaps slightly more controversially, is would you ask a white man that question? Now, when I use the term white men here, I'm using it to reflect the group that have traditionally dominated Scottish media, the privileged few, to use the term Miranda used in her introduction. Now, depending on the sector you're working in, that might not actually be white men, that dominant group. So if, for instance, you're reporting on nursing, the default figure might actually be assumed to be a white woman. But asking that question the reason I want you to think about this, or all of us to think about this, is that findings of research consistently point to the way that members of minority or marginalised groups are expected to embody that group and represent a collective viewpoint, where members of majority groups are expected to represent themselves and their expertise. So just to give you an example of that, when a white man commits a terrorist act, for instance, white men who are experts in terrorism or politics aren't asked to explain what has happened from their position as a white man. They're asked to explain what has happened from their position as an expert in terrorism or as an expert in politics. But the same respect is not accorded members of minority groups, for instance. To give another example, when Me Too went viral, it became really common practice to ask women in public life whether they had experienced sexual harassment and abuse, even if it wasn't what they were there to talk about. So you may remember there was a really famous video that went viral of the actor Uma Thurman being asked exactly that question on the red carpet. But we also saw lots of examples of this in Scotland, where politicians, female politicians in particular, were being asked about their experiences of sexual harassment, even if what they were there to talk about was something else entirely. I had an experience of this on a radio show relatively recently, where I was one of a number of guests invited on for our expertise on gender and misogyny in the media. And yet one of the first questions asked of a barrister who appeared on the programme was whether she had experienced misogyny in the workplace. So it takes her away from that position as the expert who's drawing on a range of evidence to personalise the experience. And then related to that is my third and final question, and then I will wrap up, which again echoes something Miranda touched on in her introduction, which is, would you describe a white man in that way? Now, again, that's with the caveat that white man here means whoever is dominant within a particular sector. And funnily enough, Miranda, football was one of the examples I had immediately reached for in thinking about this. I'd be interested to know, if you look at today's papers and broadcast news, whether coverage of last night's game of Scotland versus England talks about the women's game, for instance, or talks about it as a national football game. And if you compare that to coverage of something like the Euros draw at the weekend, was that referred to as the men's tournament? Now, that's what we call the default male principle. So do we just assume that the category footballer is male, for instance, and therefore anyone who deviates from that has to be marked? There's a great satirical account on social media called Man Who Has It All, which pokes fun at exactly this default male principle and talks about things, for instance, like the use of generic false gendered terms like fireman or firewoman, they turn it around, to represent all firefighters. There's two other principles to take into account there, as well as the default male principle, the default authority principle. Who do you believe and give importance to, and on what basis? So how are they positioned in the story, and what language is used to describe contributions? Miranda's example from earlier of said or claimed, for instance. And that's something we might pick up on, I imagine, in relation to reporting on men's violence against women. And then the final one, the default visibility principle. Do all appearances matter equally? Are people who are seen equally heard from? And if you're describing the physical appearance of people in a written article, are you describing the physical appearance of all people or only some? Now, if you want to know more about some of this work, you can access further learning in our free open online learning course, which I think will appear in the chat shortly, which was launched in 2019 and is still available online. And we're hoping to update that content over the next year. But there is still content available there which draws on many of the people and organisations who are speaking with you today. And one of those is Talat Yaqoob, who's our next speaker, and who is an award-winning campaigner, consultant and writer examining systemic inequality. She's the co-chair of the First Minister's Advisory Council of Women and Girls, a fellow of the RSE, a founder of the incredible Pass the Mic project, which I think she will talk to you more about now. So it's an absolute delight to hand over to Talat.
Sorry, don't know what happened there. I was trying to unmute. Thank you, Karen. My name, as has been said, is Talat Yaqoob, and I had the pleasure of working with Professor Karen Boyle and Melody House on the work around the research on women of colour's representation in Scottish media. So I want to take an opportunity to be able to talk a little bit about Pass the Mic, where it started from, what it is, and what we've learned of it so far. So Pass the Mic is a directory essentially of women of colour expertise across Scotland. On it, you will find environmentalists, astrophysicists, economists, haters, teachers, campaigners over a wide range of issues and expertise. Now, it started as an Excel spreadsheet that was on my personal laptop. And the reason it existed is because of the lack of women of colour that exist as expertise, included in media, but also in influencing public narratives and participating in community, in commentary in a wider sense around influencing of policy too. Now, it started as most things have in my life, out of a fit of rage, and largely because of my experience of and being involved in commentary and media engagement and interviews for a wide range of research work that I have done previously. The moment that this was really reflected for me was a point that Karen made about being asked to be a representative for everybody. So as a woman of colour, being asked to be a representative of all women and indeed people of colour. I have often been asked to be involved in interview panels, whether that's TV, media, providing quotes for different issues in newspapers. And when I can't do it, and when I don't have the expertise or I don't have the availability, I have always had a small list of women of colour experts on an Excel spreadsheet that I share with the journalists, the editor that has gotten in touch. The vast majority of the times, that person was not engaged unless it was a very specific issue. In fact, a lot of the time, the story wasn't taken in that angle, or it was just dropped because it wasn't somebody convenient and easy to get in touch with that could pursue that particular line in that story. So from finding that often the women that I'm recommended were not then pursued and engaged by media, I started to question whether just having it as a private document for me to promote women of colour was enough. And indeed, I had already been thinking about the need for something like Pass the Mic and researching whether that existed. But it solidified, my need for it solidified when in late autumn in 2019, I was called to ask to come on and give my take on my experience as a migrant to Scotland. Now, my migration journey started in Portobello in Edinburgh, so I'm not entirely sure what migration it is that they were referring to. But of course, what they saw was a person of colour and assuming that the experiences are homogenous across that community, and that because I do some stuff on equality, I'm probably this person, that's an easy person for me to call. Now, within that is a fairly offensive stereotype and assumption that we are all the same, and you can call one person to represent wide ranges of diverse communities. But it reflected what happens when the pace of news does not give you the opportunity to reflect on what it is you're actually asking of someone. So from that, I created the website and Pass the Mic. It started with around 20 women of colour. It currently exists at over 200 women of colour with wide-ranging expertise. Since the beginning of the launch of it, we have since had 3 cohorts of women of colour writers who have been linked in with media bodies, newspapers and magazine and TV to get support to edit and be paid for an opinion piece and contribution. The reason for doing that is to normalise their visibility within media and also for them to have a show reel or an example of their expertise being published or broadcast. We have been working with a wide range, including STV, the Herald, Scotsman, Courier, Press and Journal, for example, and others. In that time, the first round was in 2020. We've had 3 cohorts and just over 60 women of colour engaged in that, many of whom have continued to be regular commentators within media, and indeed some have jobs within the media now too. Earlier this year in summer, we, thanks to Scottish University's Insight Institute, were given funding to host the first Women of Colour gathering on media expertise in Scotland. It was a phenomenal day. It was a day that was hugely effective and symbolic because we were coming together as a group, which happens all too rarely in Scotland. During that time, we had roundtable discussions to be able to understand and unpick what was going on in media and what more needed to happen. From that, we have created a briefing that is for anybody working in and around media and comms within Scotland, which is available on the Pass the Mic website and indeed on the Pass the Mic Scotland Twitter. You'll be able to see it on the pinned tweet there. And it highlights a few key things that came out as themes from that day, which I want to go through with you today. The first has already been spoken about and was really the setting of the tone for Pass the Mic in the first place. The homogenization of communities and the need for one person to be a representative for whole communities when that is not expected of the majority in one space. The example of denouncing a criminal attack, criminality or a terrorist attack being experienced, I've had directly within radio and TV. The second was the issue of false equivalence. So in the name of balance, pursuing a false equivalence between 2 areas of thought, one being often evidenced and the other being an extreme view that is in contrast to or conflict to one other person's position. Often what happens is that creates a false equivalence, that both of these things are balanced, are equally legitimate, are equally evidenced, and that's very rarely the case. False equivalence often puts those who experience inequalities in direct debate with those who want to delegitimize and erase their experiences of inequalities and belittle them. I'll give you an example of this. I have on many occasions been asked to speak about the gender pay gap with somebody who believes that the gender pay gap is not real. That's false equivalence. The evidence tells us that that is absolutely not the case. A climate expert being asked to have a climate scientist, an expert being asked to have a debate with somebody who believes that the climate crisis does not exist. That's false equivalence and is not progressing debate and is looking at an extreme that doesn't exist in the majority of the population, and it's legitimizing a perspective that is not legitimate with evidence and engagement. One of the experiences that I've had that's quite vivid of this is during the experience of COVID-19 and being talking about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of colour and migrant communities, and the fact that that is down to an institutionalized and historic racism, and being pitched against somebody for the sake of clicks, for the sake of radio, for the sake of so-called debate, as somebody who does not believe that racism exists in modern society. So false equivalent actually creates a hostile space and does not progress commentary, discussion. That doesn't mean that you don't discuss and create debates with somebody who may be in opposition to you, of course, but without that evidence base, it creates hostility when somebody who is perhaps particularly experiencing racism and sexism is pitched against somebody that does not believe their experiences are founded in evidence or real. That is a hostility that women of colour have had to put up with too often within media. And it's one of the reasons why many of them have participated and then opted out of future participation. With a lack of representation, that cannot be afforded. It also creates, that false equivalence also creates a lack of nuance in being given the space and the time to discuss what really matters. moving on discussions from somebody saying that racism does exist and another person saying it doesn't exist, and instead thinking about and debating the different ways in which we can make progress and tackle inequalities, as opposed to still in 2023 debating if those inequalities really do exist. The other issue that was repeatedly mentioned was how often women of colour are asked to come along and speak about a negative story or a spin towards a negative story about their own communities. They were keen to be able to have the opportunity to talk about positive engagement, positive stories and success stories of their communities. And in particular, this was very clear from the migrant community when we have heard when we see increasing hostilities towards migrant communities and in particular asylum seekers. One of the things that has come up, and I hope to do more research on, is about the use of imagery, and when the use of images, particularly of communities of colour, migrants and women of colour, are used in stories that are not reflective of that community, but are used to as clickbait and to create a illusion of negativity with that community. One of the things that women of colour have repeatedly talked about in that session that we had earlier this year was the desperate need for images to be thought through before they are used for the negative consequences they create in media. And finally, one that will be very much understood by people who are on this call, access to participation, access to engagement, and how much it's a closed door that feels like it's who you know, as opposed to based on meritocracy, and that needs to be tackled to allow everyone to have access to those roles. And the second of all is pay, the low level of pay and the unstable pay that exists, particularly in freelance, particularly as commentators and as opinion writers, that makes it an often non-viable participation for many women of colour who are more likely to be experiencing poverty and inequality. Finally, two things that I think are really important to highlight is women of colour are disproportionately more likely to experience social media abuse for having an opinion, not any particular opinion, just the audacity of an opinion. And so therefore it becomes really important for there to be good safety and safeguarding checks around commentary that is under the line in the comments section, and also who you tag, share, and how you promote the story, and the headlines and tags that you use to promote the story online to prevent more abuse finding its way to women of colour. And very lastly, one thing that was talked about, I think I've said lastly 3 times now, so I'll try and this will be the last one, to move away from the deficit model. If we are looking to engage and improve the representation of women of colour, that doesn't happen because you try and fix the women of colour. It happens because you fix the issue, the culture, the system in which we produce media and commentary. Often we are doing outreach activities, which certainly have their place, but outreach activities and engagement that focuses on confidence building and skills of women of colour. Whilst that has its place, the idea that confidence building will tackle underrepresentation of some and overrepresentation of others is farcical. It's the system in itself that needs to change, and the culture, where both of the meeting of confidence and the meeting of a safe, competent and welcoming space is found in the middle to create genuine representation and viability of existence long-term for women of colour. So we need to move away from the deficit model and push a system change model. All of this and more is available on the Pass the Mic website, the purpose of which is to carry on doing more of this, doing media accountability, and also creating opportunities for women of colour to tell their stories in a way that feels appropriate and suitable to them, and to change not just what media looks like, but also what media produces to be more representative of Scotland. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that was I'm aware that I've only got 1 minute left. So I'm going to hand over now to Jo Zawadzka, who's the Campaigns and Engagement Officer at Zero Tolerance, leading on their work on the Right to End Violence Against Women Awards. Thank you, Jo.
Thank you very much, Talat. I'll try to share my screen. I hope you can see the presentation now. Let me just move that. Okay, yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I recommend pass the mic to all journalists I interact with. I work as a campaigns and engagement officer, and a big part of my role is to support the media to report violence against women and girls in a responsible and accurate way. We offer a range of resources for journalists and editors, including media guidelines for print and broadcast, and also a selection of free stock images. These guidelines align with and are endorsed by IPSO Editors Code of Practice and Impress Standards Code. We also conduct annual media monitoring, and together with the End Violence Against Women Coalition, we run a UK-wide competition, the Right to End Violence Against Women Awards, to recognize and reward good writing on violence against women. In this presentation, I will cover some key definitions, and I will also talk briefly about some recommendations for reporting violence against women from our media guidelines. I aim to talk for about 15 minutes, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have in our Q&A session afterwards. But before I move on to my presentation, I would like to show you a short video we produced this year for the SCBO Essential Sector campaign that talks about our media work.
A Scotland free from men's violence against women and girls is possible. And at Zero Tolerance, we work to make this happen.
We want to end violence against women, so no woman has to experience it ever. We know we can do this by shaping attitudes and achieving gender equality.
We provide journalists and editors with guidance and stock images so that they can report on men's violence against women and girls responsibly.
There weren't really any kind of media guidelines, or certainly widely followed media guidelines, on how people like myself should cover these stories when they happen. So I went about looking into it a bit more, came across Zero Tolerance's work on the issue, thought it looked very impressive, and everything sort of snowballed from there, so to speak.
I think for me, sharing a story about forced marriage was really important, because the majority of the time when forced marriage becomes in the media, it's because women are dead. And it was important to me that women who were surviving and actually living their lives were in the media.
You know, saying survivor rather than victim, for example, might seem to someone who's never experienced the kind of things we're talking about like a very insignificant difference that has no impact at all, but actually it can have a huge impact, and the guidelines are a great way of highlighting that.
You're sharing your story, you get the confidence, you're connected to the right people. The negative could be that you can lose loved ones because you're sharing a personal story, and the reaction that comes in the world you can't control.
What we as journalists write and broadcast and say, you know, really does have an impact.
Well, it's important the media has ethical guidelines around how we report violence against women, because if we don't have that, then women are not going to come forward. And if there's going to be undertones of victim blame, and women will not come forward. So it's very important that we don't scare women into more silence than we already are in silence.
As James and Nyla said in the video, even small changes into the way you write about violence against women can make a massive difference to victim survivors. When I heard Nyla's story for the first time, I was deeply concerned by the severity of the impact the media coverage has had on her personal life. She was ostracized by her family and community and received threats of violence and had to move out from where she lived. Her story was sensationalized in the media and was stigmatizing for her community, instead of showing a positive story of someone who had the courage to speak out and who turned their life around after experiencing violence. When Nyla decided to go public with her story, she did it because she wanted other women like her to see themselves in her story, encourage them to seek support, and give them some hope that a different future is possible. And we needed this type of stories more in the media. So the sensitivity and awareness of the impact of the story is very important, and even more so for survivors of forms of violence against women that are not very well understood by the society. And while the awareness of some forms of violence against women has increased over the years, and here I'm talking about domestic abuse and sexual violence, the forms of violence that affect women from marginalized groups are still underreported in the media. In our recent media monitoring, there was less than 5% of stories which featured women of color. And when these women don't see these stories in the media, they may not even know they are experiencing violence, and therefore they stay in these situations for longer and are suffering long-term impact and consequences of this violence. So there is a vital role of the media plays in helping people understand violence against women better, to raise awareness of how pervasive it is, what the causes are, and who is affected, and how it can be prevented. One of the primary drivers of violence against women is high level of acceptance of this violence in the society, and the way we write about violence against women is hugely important. There is a debate whether media reflects our attitudes or shapes them. I would say it's a little bit of both. And while the research on exactly how media affects attitudes is limited, there is some research that shows that media reporting plays a significant role in people's understanding of violence. So, for example, if the media sympathizes with the perpetrator or stigmatizes the community, the audience tends to adopt this attitude too. So first of all, I would like to give you an overview of some key definitions. Very briefly, I mentioned earlier that some forms of violence against women and girls are better understood than others. So the UN definition says that violence manifests in different forms and is extending beyond physical actions to encompass power and control. And this perspective is echoed in Scottish law and policy. The forms of violence and abuse are vast, extending beyond the physical to the psychological, structural, and emotional. Violence against women is a pervasive problem that manifests in various forms. On the slide, you can see what's included in Scotland's Equally Safe strategy, from domestic homicide to internet abuse, female genital mutilation to rape. The list unfortunately goes on, but what ties these horrifying acts together is a common root cause, which is women's inequality. And this inequality is further exacerbated for certain groups of women and influenced by factors such as ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and gender identity, to name the few. In 2002, 84 women lost their lives to violence by men in the UK. This is an increase compared with the previous years and the highest number since March 2019. Ethnic minority women, particularly those from Black and minority backgrounds, often endure heightened levels of violence against women in terms of frequency, severity, and duration. And this includes increased risk of domestic homicide and abuse-driven suicide. But violence against women can affect any woman anywhere, regardless of their age, sexual orientation, racial, religious, cultural, and economic backgrounds. But women facing multiple forms of discrimination and disadvantage are disproportionately targeted for violence and abuse. People often say that women are vulnerable to violence, but it's important to reframe this narrative and think about it differently. Being vulnerable does not automatically result in violent behavior. Instead, women are deliberately targeted by men who feel entitled to be violent. And this small change in framing can help people understand that violence is perpetrator's choice, and women's barriers and challenges they face in their daily lives are not themselves enablers of violence, but can, of course, be reinforcing factors. Next, let's look at some examples of media coverage. On the left on the slide, you can see some of these examples of media coverage that gives excuses or justifies the actions of the perpetrators. We often see a lot of sympathy for the perpetrators. They are portrayed as people who are good guys who lost control. But it's important to understand that men who harm their partners are less likely to do it in public where others can see it. Instead, they choose to do it behind closed doors where no one can witness it. And this shows that they have a very strong sense of control. So it's important to understand that violence against women isn't because the perpetrators are out of control. In fact, it's more about a repeated pattern of control. So when you write about violence against women, it's important to avoid presenting the perpetrators as otherwise good guys. Men who perpetrate abuse are also often described as monsters or as beasts, when in reality, these are ordinary men. It's someone's dad, someone's brother, someone's friend, and framing them as monsters ignores the wider context of violence against women and perpetuates myths of who the perpetrators are. We often see alcohol, drugs, and mental health issues and anger management problems as causes of violence against women. But again, violence happens on purpose following a repeated pattern of men's choices. There are more hints and tips on framing the perpetrators, but what I wanted to highlight here is to focus not on the impact of the crime on the perpetrators, but focus on the harm of the crime on the victim survivors. I included a little picture of the coverage of the Sun newspaper where the perpetrators are being quoted. We recommend avoiding quoting perpetrators because it can normalize their attitudes and traumatize victim survivors. Here I included some examples of victim blaming in press articles that we see very often. And some of the things that you need to consider is to put the victim survivors at the center of the story, and again, focus on how this violence affected them, include diverse voices, and build relationships with organizations advocating for minoritized women in order to build that trust that is very much needed because in these communities, women are often silenced, as Naila said, and a lot of them don't feel very confident interacting with the media. In terms of terminology, we prefer using term victim survivors, but we also recommend checking with that person which term they would prefer. One note on images. We see a lot of images with beaten and bruised women. This has changed over the years, and we offer free stock images that are available on our website to combat that misconception that violence is only physical. So you can find them on our website. Got 2 more points. More generally, when you write about violence against women, it's important to put that individual incident of violence in some context of statistics, and also be very clear about the root cause of violence against women, which is gender inequality. Avoid justifying men's violence by blaming it on external factors. And also, when covering various forms of violence against women affecting women from minoritized communities, you need to remember that these practices are rooted in misogyny to avoid stigmatizing a particular ethnic group. And last but not least, we see very few stories that include helplines. This is hugely important for victim survivors. The full list of helplines for Scotland and the rest of the country is on our website, alongside with other resources. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it helpful. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nikki Simpson. Nikki is the founder of the International Magazine Centre and coordinates their annual conference, International Magazine Street. She has worked in and around media and publishing for many years, including the Professional Publishers Association of Scotland. She is passionate about increasing diversity in creative spaces historically dominated by white men. Over to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Jo. And thank you everyone for your fantastic talks. They were really great and some fascinating perspectives brought up there. I know I've already started adding to the Menti, which is asking us what we've learned from today. So before I hand over to Doni, who's our next speaker, I believe we're going to put the Menti link. Are we putting it in the chat, or how's that working? Okay, so if you access the Menti in the chat there's a link, and we'll be asked 2 questions. First of all, what have you learned? So if people would like to put some notes in there. I know I've personally taken lots of notes. I think it's interesting about the false equivalence idea. I'd like to hear a bit more about that if we have a bit of time for Q&A at the end. Talat, I think it was you that talked about that, wasn't it? I think that there's a lot of assumption, especially from organisations like the BBC, for example, that there has to be the completely opposing view. So I'd love to hear more about what your suggestions are there for still bringing in what they might perceive as equality, but without giving rise to you know, ridiculous conversations that, you know, shouldn't really be focused on. The need for the conversation to move beyond whether equality exists and move to how we deal with it. Yeah, absolutely. Women of colour more likely to get abuse online. Yep. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting one too, that women of colour use more in photos than in text as sources and subjects. There's a lot of there's a lot of people just who want to you know, pretend like they're diverse, and they just put an image in there but actually don't really think about what's useful to people. And then that violence against women, not about being out of control, but actually history of being highly controlling. I really like that. I mean, I don't like it, you know what I mean? And then our next question, what will you take away with you today? And if you're in the Menti slide, you just click next question there and it will bring you to the next one. From my own personal perspective, I'm really interested in the not what you know, it's who you know. I think in the creative industries, of which the media is one, we tend to kind of perceive that it's open access to everybody, but that actually it's quite difficult to get on anywhere if you don't know lots of people. Yeah, the deficit model, moving away from fixing the people who are underrepresented. It's like victim blaming, really, isn't it? And need for better reporting on violence, absolutely. I think I'd be really interested to see how many people go on to work for newspapers where there's a racist rhetoric, because those media outlets will continue to exist in that they might make money, right? As long as they make money, they'll continue to exist. So how do we change that from the inside out? Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic resource from Pass the Mic there. I know I'll be looking through that as well. Editorial decisions need to change, the images used, the headlines used, getting more people who are marginalized to influence that. Again, I think if we want to attract marginalized people to come and work in the media, then we need to be able to show them that they're welcome, right? Yeah. That's the biggest thing, really, that language is important, and we all need to think about this all the time. I, for one, learn through talking, and that can be really difficult because I often stumble over my words. But I think if you don't open your mouth in the first place, then you're just part of the problem, right? So being brave enough to get it wrong is a good thing. At least you're talking, at least people can correct you then, rather than just saying nothing. Thank you, everyone. Think about the verbs we use, yeah. We're going to hear from, excuse me, we're going to hear from Margaret soon, but before that, I'm delighted to introduce Doni Aldine, who was one of our speakers at Magazine Street, and very kindly came across from America to impress the masses with her excellent talk. Doni is, excuse me, the founder and CEO of Culture's global multicultural magazine. She's developed university curricula for global culture identity, and until last year was on the faculty for journalism and media communication at Colorado State University. She's passionate about creating community for cross-cultural populations, which I'm sure she's going to tell us more about in a minute. We also welcomed her, as I say, at Magazine Street. So I'm delighted to introduce her. Over to you, Doni.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to be here. Excuse my voice. It's early in the US where I am right now. And I actually just came off of an international trip, as I did when I spoke at Magazine Street, which is absolutely phenomenal. So I hope that many of you have attended, and I look forward to attending again in the future. Thanks for the intro. And yes, I'm very excited about global culture identity and really teaching about 21st century cultural diversity. So we will talk about why that matters and why it matters in your journalism career. In addition to what Nikki had just talked about, I had the pleasure and privilege of being voted one of the top women in media globally, as well as it's important, I think, all of what we've learned today about diversity, whether it's women, cultural, minoritized, the terms that are used, being very understanding about all of the information that's out there and continually educating yourself. I'll be touching on all of those things and why they're important. So 21st century cultural diversity is important because many people aren't aware, as of 2018, more than 283 million people lived outside of their passport cultures. And at that point, it was growing 20% a year. As of now, it's growing more than that. So much so that it's hard to keep up with the numbers. But I'm sure you all have seen in Scotland and around the world, you see influencers traveling, you see a number of people who have become digital nomads. But what's often forgotten are the people who grew up this way. So this is what we're going to focus on today. Again, it's important not only because so many people, it affects so many people and countries, but also because the world is increasingly diverse. The countries around the world that are not considered brown are increasingly becoming brown. As an example, we use the United States in 2019. As of 2019, more young people are no longer quote unquote minorities who've been minoritized. I'll touch on that in a second, but they are actually the majority. So people under the age of 19 in the United States, they are actually majority culture if they are people of color. So that brings me to what Cultures does as an organization. We focus on the cultural in-between, which you see on the screen. We encourage people to embrace their cultural in-between. And what does that mean? Our population is made up of multi-ethnic, multicultural, mixed race, and geographically mobile people. Geographically mobile includes people like immigrants, refugees, third culture kids. Third culture kids are people who grow up globally. So while they're formulating their identity, very often it's because of their parents' positions, whether that's in the military brat, a diplomat's kid, international business kid. Those positions and forming their identity at an early age in many different cultures changes who they are. it changes their worldview. And they're able to use those traits to help them in the future. So this cultural in-between, this population, is very much the focus of cultures, because we believe that's the face of 21st century cultural diversity. It's not just a belief. In the 1950s, sociologist Ted Ward said that such people are the prototype citizens of the future. We are currently in that future. And every day the numbers are changing. Every day the attitudes should be changing. And I hope, and I'm excited to see my, my fellow panelists, because the information that we're imparting here is making a difference. And as journalists and budding journalists, you too can make a difference. Every piece of information here should be not only absorbed today, but paid attention to on a regular basis. I will touch on this going forward as well. So Cultures reaches more than 1 million people every month around the world. We hit 200 countries and territories, and we embrace this cultural in-between because we believe that everyone should feel like they matter. So a big part of what we do is making sure that people can live in full color. No pun intended about people of color, but really living a vibrant life, really having people understand you and know who you are. That's part of, as I just suggested, always making sure that you're paying attention to what is coming up, being up on the current situations culturally for different types of people, educating yourself on their situations and not just looking through the world through your own lens. Again, back to third culture kids and people who are geographically mobile or in the cultural in-between, the beauty of having a lifestyle like that and growing up like that is that you're able to see the world in many different facets. There are 13 different cultural dimensions that come with 21st century cultural diversity, and those are called being cross-cultural. And the more of those dimensions you have, the more you can relate to other people. The sad part of that is monocultural people can relate to you less and less because they have a wide berth for their worldview, and someone who's monocultural has a specific berth of their worldview. So educating yourself, coming to sessions like this, making sure that you're constantly paying attention and reaching outside of your own world is key as a journalist to make sure that you can give good reporting in Scotland and beyond. So becoming, focusing on the cultural in between, what's important here is 3 things I'll talk to you about today. What you see is not always what you get. Focusing on cultural understanding and applying that understanding so you can make a difference. You know, recently, again, always educating yourself, I pride myself in constantly learning and growing. I'm seen as an expert in this field. I've been in journalism for 30 years. My undergrad is in journalism. I taught at university, as you've heard, but it's so important to constantly learn. And I've been fortunate in the last few years to learn a lot about how enslaved people evolved around the world over time, how the terms of race that we use have evolved over time. It's very interesting that racial terms evolved right around the time that slavery did. And a lot of that came about because it was easier to see who's enslaved if you can identify them visually, right? Race before that really wasn't a construct that was widely used. And so constantly educating yourself, make sure that you're expanding your perspective and applying that to the reporting that you do on a daily basis. One of the books that was created back way when racism, or I should say when enslavement began, is part of the reason that we see some of the stereotypes that we see of people. Of course, majority populations don't want to be viewed as monsters. As we heard earlier, men don't necessarily want to be viewed as monsters. So you create a narrative that makes it, that legitimizes why you may be treating different groups differently than a group that looks like you. This is the power of journalism. Look how many centuries later that has endured. The words you use matter. The things you say in broadcast and write in print media make a difference, and they stick with people, whether we realize them or not. They often stick with us subconsciously. So what you see is not always what you get. Everyone deserves to feel seen. And visual diversity is important, as we've heard here. Representation is very important. Hidden diversity is important as well. So when we talk about those 13 dimensions, we're talking about international adoptees. We're talking about mixed race people who may be racially ambiguous. Myself, I'm an Afro-Latina. You wouldn't know that by looking at me or listening to me. My accent sounds American. I look what people in the United States call African-American or Black. However, my background is not that. I'm Afro-Latina Caribbean, and I lived in 7 cultures growing up, 5 continents. That is who I am underneath. That is what I identify as. That is what I know and how I interact in the world. But when you look at me, you see a certain thing. How does this change your reporting? What words will you use to identify me? Or would you wait and speak with me in your interview, ask questions to really understand what is the background, so the information that you use really pertains to the person that you're interviewing and the population that you are speaking of. Very, very important. So the first tip is hidden as well as visual diversity is important. So when we talk about mixed race, multi-ethnic, multicultural, geographically mobile people, like immigrants, refugees, and third culture kids, it's important to understand their background so that you can understand where they're coming from with the comments that they make to you, rather than bending the comments to meet what you may have decided previously, unbeknownst to you, or sometimes consciously, about what your article will be. I was about to name the news outlet, but there's a very big international news outlet that when I worked with them probably 20 years ago, the mainstay of reporting was never ask a question that you don't already know the answer to. Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's so much to learn from the people that you're interviewing. They have a better story in them than you have already predicated in your mind. So use your interviewing skills to learn their story and use that in your reporting. When you balance a story, it's not the same as opposing viewpoints. Make sure it's true balance. We'll get to that in a second. So again, everyone deserves to feel seen, and it's important that you understand who they are rather than who you think they are. So the world tries to tell you who you are, who you should be, but that individual knows better than you do. So do not have the hubris to think, oh, you understand this population, you understand these people, so you are the person that can write about them. They are educating you. You may be educated, but they know their population, they know their personal lives better than you do. Listen and use that in your reporting. So that brings us to cultural understanding and why that's important. Have the courage. This work takes courage. Stepping out of yourself takes courage. Being clear that you don't know everything takes courage. Because as journalists, we often have to be experts, right? We're experts at delivering the story. Have the courage to understand that you're not an expert in anything else than deliver. You may be, but as a whole, you're an expert in delivering the story. So deliver it well. Show your expertise. Teach others what they should know about the story that you are trying to deliver. All right. It takes courage. It takes humility. Understand what you may know and take the time to better understand and assimilate that information that is new to you. All right. Even if it doesn't hit right the first time, keep working at it. Keep interviewing people who are different from you. Make sure that you're looking for perspectives outside of what you normally would. This often is the issue. We see this in hiring as well. Often people I see it in the magazine industry too. Oh, we looked for people of color for that position. We couldn't find anyone. Or in magazines, oh, we're trying to advertise with publications of color. There are none out there. We can't find them. Well, they're there. Perhaps you need to change your perspective on how to seek for them. All right. If you expand your network, if you know different people, how many different cultures are in your network? How many people of color are in your network? The more you know, the more you can find. If everyone around you looks like you, your perspective will be homogeneous. Work tirelessly to continuously learn. As you can hear, that's a big message of mine. And again, I'm considered an expert in this field, but I'm constantly learning more. I'm constantly going out and looking and making sure that I understand other people, because the world is vast. None of us can be completely knowledgeable all the time. In addition, the world is moving quickly. As with digital, things are changing rapidly. It behooves us, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're going out there and making a difference every day. So have that courage to understand that you don't know everything. Have the humility to sit back and listen, and some grace to say when you don't know. The other thing that takes courage is to ask, whether it's people of color, in the disability range, in LGBTQIA, have the courage to ask the questions that you don't understand. And, sometimes you might get smacked around a little bit, like, oh, that was a terrible question, or what, why don't you know that? But that's where the courage comes in, because how will you learn if you don't ask? So many people are willing just to move on, keep quiet, and not say anything because they don't want to be embarrassed. That's where the courage comes in. Continually learn. And then I'm going to talk a little bit. So I mentioned the cross-cultural lifestyle. I'll give you some of the dimensions I talked about in cross-cultural dimensionality. We have traditional third culture kids, which I just described, bicultural and multicultural, multi-ethnic kids, mixed race. Children of borderlanders. Borderlanders are people who live close to the border of a country. So Swiss German, or, French Italian. I can't, you know what a border is, but so borderlanders have a mix of different cultures next to them. And when you have people of color who are part of that as well, it adds to their dimensionality. Children of the minoritized. So that is very important. I hear the word minority still so many times these days. Minority is a majority term that says these people are less than. They're less than us, meaning there are fewer numbers than us. So there are minorities. However, they've been minoritized, because when you look globally, the world has more people of color than not. So when this person of color is in your space, they have been minoritized by you. So it doesn't mean they're less than, but as we use the word regularly, it feels less than. It allows the people using it to, one, either feel less than or feel superior. So think about your language and how's that used. It's not minorities necessarily. These people have been minoritized. Children of immigrants, children of refugees, and international adoptees, as I'd mentioned earlier. So those are some of the hidden diversities that people have that may have them thinking differently than you would expect. Sometimes people are hidden immigrants. I'm considered a hidden immigrant in the United States, again, because of how I look and how I sound. People assume that I think like them, and I do not. I think in a manner of someone who has grown up globally, who's been in multiple cultures, both minoritized and not, and making assumptions about what my comments mean often leads to misunderstanding. So that's one of the biggest things that you will be able to acquire and will help you move forward in your career, help you with excellent reporting, is applying true understanding. That is what makes the difference. So journalism is powerful, as I'd mentioned before. Journalism infuses thought. Journalism is part of pop culture. It makes people feel seen. It makes people feel educated. Often the print word and the broadcast word is repeated over and over and over. So how are your words making a difference? Always think that way. Am I disseminating messages that are true? Am I disseminating messages that are helpful? As journalists, we're supposed to be about truth. We're supposed to be about balance. As was mentioned before, the false equivalent is real. You know, in the United States, Black women are the most educated group in the country. They're also the most, own the most businesses, but they're paid the least. Part of that is because of the imposter syndrome that happens because you have been hearing your entire life through pop culture, through media, through socialization that you are less than. So this population is now the most educated. And as mentioned before, they may be quote unquote balanced with someone who only has an opinion. That is a false equivalent. If you have someone who's highly educated and is able to speak on their subject, the balance should be other factual information about that subject, not someone who has an opinion about that subject. So think that through when you are choosing your sources, when you're choosing the subjects of your stories. Are you choosing this person because you think they know? And do you think they know because of how they look? Are they white males? And so that gives them the sense of authority? Or did you have to go to, and for your person of color, did you go to someone who's highly educated and they had to be educated because they couldn't possibly know? Think that through when you're thinking about equivalence and balance. Now, the last thing I'll leave you with when you're applying your understanding to make a difference, remember the one statement rule. You know, it's interesting working with the population that we do, the cultural in between, it only takes a word or two from a story that may seem quote unquote mainstream to a story that makes someone feel seen. Just a word or two that says, oh, that journalist gets it. That story is for me. That's the same for mainstream journalism as well. So I'll give you two examples. During my journalism classes, I taught about how often for people of color, words like scurried were used. However, for criminals that weren't people of color, the word run might be used, or they ran versus they scurried. What do you think of when you hear of scurrying? Little rodents, pests. If you're using those types of terms, it might seem like the perfect term for what you're speaking of, but is that term correct? Is that term also giving an additional connotation to the person you've chosen, and that subconscious, you didn't even realize that had happened? Pay attention to those types of words that you may use. The last example I'll leave you with is page 5 versus page 15. So an example it often uses from current Hurricane Katrina, again in the United States. Apologize that all these examples are from the US, but in the United States, there on page 5, there was a person of color carrying a black trash bag. And if you know, the trash bags in the US that are black, they're like 35-gallon bags, so very large, with water from the hurricane that had flooded a specific section of the city up to their chest, pulling the black trash bag that supposedly was full of food. The description of this picture on page 5, which is close to the front of the paper, was that this was a person who had looted a business, okay, with the food in their bag. On page 15 was a similar person, but not a person of color. Similar situation, similar bag. And the cut line for that photo was residents foraging for food. Same day, same paper, different page. So one is closer to the front, more likely to be seen, and characterizing an illegal act for people of color. Same photo, same action for a non-person of color, but just a few words changes the connotation. So that is what I'd leave you with. Actively seek to diversify your stories. Actively seek to diversify your mind. Actively seek to understand and vet the quotes and photos that you use in telling your story. Doing this will ensure that you grow into the 21st century, that you are on the right side of history in terms of who is going to be the majority going forward, and that you increase your understanding, not just for your personal life, but for the stories that you tell. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to Miranda. Or is it Margaret next?
It's me. I'm just going to say thank you, first of all, to you, Doni. That was excellent. I really appreciate that. I think we all really appreciate it. A really interesting perspective that maybe a lot of us don't think about. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Margaret Hughes now, who's going to be hosting our panel session. Margaret's a dear friend of mine. I've known her for years now, and I really enjoy working with her. She's Senior Lecturer at the University of West of Scotland, Chair of the World Journalism Education Council, and sits on the Executive Committee of the Association of Journalism Education, where she was previously Secretary. Is that right, Margaret?
Chair.
Oh, Chair, apologies. For far too many years, I think. Not in a bad way. I wanted you to stay, but I mean, I didn't want you to stay. I mean, you know what I mean. I'll shut up now. Her research interests include the development of journalism education, the magazine industry, and equality in journalism. What I mean is that you did a good stint, and that you know, it was okay. I'll stop talking now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, Nikki, and that's a lovely welcome from you. And, you know, as Nikki says, we have known each other for a long time, and it's so great to have her involvement here today along with everybody else. I just want to start by saying thank you so much to Karen, Talat, Joe and Doni for, I think, what were really inspiring, thought-provoking, depressing, but actually I think hopeful conversations that each of them had. What we'd like to do is we're going to have a question and answer session for maybe about the next 15 or 20 minutes. So what we would ask you to do is to please put any questions you might have for any of the panel in the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up there. So we don't have any yet, but I'm going to, you know, having the privilege of the chair, just kick off, and I actually think probably any of the speakers might want to answer this question, but I think I'm maybe going to ask Talat to think about it, because when in each of the presentations, I was really struck by something that I tell my students that I teach journalism to, that basically journalism is just people telling their own stories back to themselves in lots of different ways, and that running right through that, I suppose there needs to be that sense and that understanding of our humanity in whatever way that we understand that. And I was really struck by just listening to everything today, even some of the stats that and the stories that Joe was sharing from Zero Tolerance. It really made me think, you know, how much is journalism leaning into our humanity these days? Are we finding that actually there's a bit of a deficit there, or a really big deficit there? But what I'm wondering is, Talat, you said that, you know, you were struck by this lack of inequality, probably from when you were really young, but particularly when you were asked specific questions, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. Have you seen any green shoots of change since then? I think I'm grasping at hope here.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question. I do think it comes back to kind of fighting the model that media has been pushed into, the monopolization of, you know, mass media being owned by, you know, one person, actually, the vast majority of them, and the onus on the number of clicks, the profit that generates, the advertising revenue that generates. That means that you lean into unnuanced controversy as opposed to discussion, development, learning, thought-provoking pieces. There's been a death of the kind of double spread long read, right? The get yourself a cuppa and read the Sunday newspapers. That's not an environment I grew up in, but it's an environment I had hoped that would continue, right? And I think that puts pressure on even the journalists that want to do good, because they are pushed into an editorial space or a profit margin that's actually asking them to lose a bit of their humanity. So there is a little bit of the pushback of the culture that's really, really needed here. Mm-hmm. I've seen some, you know, green shoots, as you're saying. There's a fair number of media kind of platforms that have gotten in touch with me who want to be really proactive about the representation of women of colour in Scottish media. And as a consequence, I can track and I can see the fact that actually, yes, I'm seeing more of them on the 6 o'clock news. I'm seeing more of them quoted in a newspaper. But what I think is, I desperately want to see more of, is them being asked for their expertise beyond telling the story of racism or sexism. They're still locked into a space of perceived identity, actually really similar to what Doni was talking about, locked into this position, as opposed to, well, who are you as a whole? And can we get your expertise on environmentalism? And the experience of racism when you went to COP, right? So there's different elements of it. But I certainly see some green shoots in the number of people that I am seeing taking it seriously and actually putting a bit of a target for themselves on the number of visible minoritized communities that are on our screens and in our papers.
Karen, would you say, looking at the global media monitoring, which is obviously huge, it's just a vast piece of work, and obviously, you know, the last, you said it was 2020, the next one's going to be, what, a couple of years' time, but see, just sort of you know, instinctually, do you feel that things are improving for the better?
Yes and no. I mean, yes, but not very fast. And I think that's the thing that's very frustrating for many of us that work in this space. And I think as well, I mean, what GMMP has its flaws. I'm not saying it's, you know, the only way to measure these things, but I think why it's useful is it uses the same methodology every 5 years. And so it gives us that snapshot, and how can we see how things, you know, using the same methodology have or haven't changed. I suppose my note of caution there would be that, you know, maybe going back to my science and health example, that when science and health was deemed maybe a less valuable news space, women were more represented within it. When COVID happened and that became kind of the dominant story, then actually the presence of women started to drop away. Now, there can be all kinds of reasons for that are also linked to, for instance, politicians becoming much more dominant in that space and other things. And GMMP can't really get at that detail. But I think what it can do is show us that we've still got work to do, that some things are helping. One of the other things I'd say about GMMP is that the figures it gives us are one thing, but in some ways more important than that is that it's a project that aims to train people how to look at their own news through that lens and see who's there and who's not there. So it's largely undertaken by volunteers. The idea is expanding the capacity of people to look at and hold their own media to account. So from that perspective, almost regardless of the results, I see it as a kind of positive development, because it's doing the kind of work that Doni was recommending, I think, as well. And I love your phrase, Doni, paying attention on a regular basis. I'm going to be adopting that a lot, as I think it's something all of us need to remember, actually, and none of us have got room for complacency. So yes, some progress, always work to do, new challenges.
Great, thanks, Karen. And thanks, Talat, for your answer. Do you know what I'm also struck by when I think about, and this might be something that Doni can say something on, often a lot of the research looks at very mainstream news media sources, because obviously they're the most plentiful and sometimes maybe more easily accessible, no more accessible, just more easily accessible. But what we've seen in the last decade or so is, you know, lots of alternative spaces for media, you know, magazines like yours, lots of different spaces. Do you feel that actually, if you were to compare mainstream news media and the picture that presents to the world, it's really quite different when you get out of that mainstream, that the world does look really different when you make the effort to go somewhere else?
The world absolutely looks different when you make the effort to go somewhere else. And that's why, you know, a number of people, I get this question all the time in terms of, why are you in print? Isn't print dead? Which I find funny, because it's often journalists who ask that. And we are media people, and we often don't realize that print actually is more coveted than digital. Now, digital is ubiquitous. You must have it. but print is so important. And for us, we grew tenfold, 1,000-fold going into print. And it's the same as many quote unquote niche publications, because they've done this because they're not represented. They know where to find these spaces, whatever that space is. They know how to find those people. So they've created a space where people can come to them and feel like they belong, come to them and feel seen. And they also know where to find the sources. Again, it's the same thing in corporate. It's the same thing in media. We have to, as journalists, have to come outside of ourselves to find those additional spaces, to find alternative people, because we're going to only look, as you've mentioned, to what's easy. Now, in my network, it's easy to find all kinds of people, no matter what they look like, right? Majority, minoritized, everyone, because I make a point to constantly be in community with those people. And that's what mainstream journalists need to understand. When you're creating a network, that network needs to look like the world you live in, not the world you exist in, the world you live in. So your circle might look a certain way, but what does your country look like? What does the global look like? What does the population that you report on look like? And should that reporting or should that population have more? As we talked about, in science, whatever, there may not be a lot of people of color, but they're still there. So they should be in your network, right? There may not be a lot of women in a specific field, but they're still there. So they should be in your network, and enough that anytime you need something, you can grab what you need and not everything looks homogeneous. So yes, I think the alternative spaces have arisen because those alternatives are not available in mainstream. And as mainstream journalists, we need to make sure that we have a network that gives voice to the alternative.
Okay, and always great to hear that print is thriving, particularly in the wonderful world of magazines. Thanks, Doni. I've got a question here in the Q&A, and this is for you, Jo. So I shall just read it out, actually, because it's on quite powerful language in it. So, struck by what Jo said about including the cause of violence against women and girls in news stories, which has, of course, that men feel entitled to be violent. How do we make this a more common analysis in news stories about violence against women and girls?
Well, I think that's a whole society conversation of how these attitudes are formed in the first place. So looking at the role of toxic masculinity, gender stereotyping in the early years, and obviously the high influence of figures such as Andrew Tate, and the attention that he gets for his views. So I think we need to challenge these narratives. We, as a women's sector, not only women's sector, we need to respond to the dynamic context in which these personalities emerge. And asks ourselves a question of how harmful these views are. And kind of the more, as I said in my presentation, the more society is aware of the cause of violence against women and connect the dots between gender inequality and violence against women and that power imbalance that we see, the more it will be reflected in the media. But for journalists themselves, I think two things are important. Again, remembering to put the incidence of violence in the context of statistics to show how widespread this issue is. And again, avoid excuses for perpetrators and point at these attitudes of entitlement and the misogyny that contributes to violence.
Do you feel really frustrated? Because I certainly know as a member of the audience who reads it, and as somebody who is in not an area of conflict, but I'm on the board of trustees of Zero Tolerance, and that really illustrates how passionately I feel about the whole issue of violence against women and girls. But I sometimes feel as a member of the audience that really frustrated that it's almost like really lazy journalism. Do you ever feel really frustrated when you're speaking to journalists, Jo, about the fact that there is just this almost automatic sort of a response to use the really tired tropes around violence against women and girls?
Yeah, it is certainly frustrating and tiring, and we see this all the time. We've seen like a small improvement in reporting of violence against women, but at the same time, we understand the pressures journalists are under to produce pieces, you know, quickly without in-depth analysis. As Doni says as well, like there is simply like people don't look beyond of what they see. And I think there is a role for journalists to be more open to different perspectives, but also reaching out to women's organizations and finding out more about this issue. And this is, I guess this is the only way for attending events like this as well, to learn more about the dynamics of power and about, you know, how we shift, how important it is to shift that narrative is crucial. But yeah, I think frustration is definitely something that I struggle with when I engage with journalists. But I also see a lot of goodwill from journalists through our Right to End Violence Against Women Awards. We see some excellent writing. And we know that people want to do more. So there is an appetite for change. And yeah, but as Karen also said, the change is very, very slow.
Although really interestingly, Jo, when we did the Right to End Violence Against Women Awards this year, most of the journalists who enter the awards are still women. So it still feels like a domain that women are writing about rather than men. And that in itself is a big issue. Karen, you wanted to pitch in with something? Thanks, Jo.
Yeah, just that one of the things that, and it's partly responding to the question in the Q&A as well, I think one of the most difficult and challenging things in this area is actually naming who is doing what to whom accurately. So a lot of the time we talk about, and we've been doing it in this chat, when I say we, I mean all of us do this. We talk about violence against women, but it's much more difficult to talk about men's violence against women. And I think that's something just to keep coming back to. Now, not all violence against women is men's violence against women. So I'm not saying they are equivalent terms.
It's a really high statistic, isn't it? Because it's like 90% or something of violence against women is perpetrated by men.
But when that is what we're talking about, we should name it as such, but it's very difficult to do, and there's often pushback and accusations that's being sexist and whatever. So I think that's the challenge for all of us. I know in my own, this is the area I work on, and I know in my own writing and research and presentations, I'll often use terms like gender-based violence or violence against women, when what I mean is men's violence against women. And I do it because it allows me into a particular space, or it lets people listen in a particular way. But sometimes we do need to name the problem, but it's one of the most challenging things to do.
But don't you think is
confrontational?
Yeah, and it's also because you're dead right. It does let the language we use does let us into some spaces, but sometimes we get into those spaces, and then we then need to revert back to the really sort of right, this is the bare bones of it. And I think that's what the challenge often is, that we get into spaces, but then we don't feel, I don't know if secure enough is the word, or safe enough sometimes actually, to actually just name it and say that this is what the challenge is. You must feel like that, Talat, sometimes.
The thing is that I completely agree with all of this. And but the issue is how quickly I become the problematic woman of colour when I do that, right? And how quickly that space becomes hostile. So I think this is where more people doing it who have majority power, as opposed to us doing it, start to really matter. And I go back to the idea of that deficit model where we're stuck in this, let's do outreach, let's do public speaking, let's do an interview skills thing with women and women of colour. Like I have no interest in Sheryl Sandberg lean in theory, right? You can't lean in to a hostile environment that's not looking for you to be there. So you've got to change the space. And that takes people who have more safety in that space using their safety to do good.
That's exactly the comment that I'd like to make. Thank you for that. You know, back to what Joe was talking about with the awards being, or maybe you were saying it, Dr. Margaret, the awards having more women than men who write about this subject, right? Just as with people of color, we need majority voices who are allies and very vocal allies to the cause. Because just as we've talked about, you know, a woman might have to have, or a woman of color might have to have all these accolades and all this education to be taken seriously, where a man, a white man, may just be taken seriously just because of who he is, right? Just because of his opinion. And when you add to that actual power and actual expertise, and that is backing a cause, it makes a huge difference. And so more men in that space. And I have to give kudos to this generation as well. I mean, I taught at Colorado State University for the last decade. And this generation is more open and understanding of women versus men and the power dynamics, and people of color versus people who aren't of color and the power dynamics, and more open to understanding and pushing forward with that. So I wholeheartedly encourage people to be allies. And again, it's that courage that's needed, right? We have to have the courage every day to speak on these things, to go out and use our voices, even if we use words that may allow us in the room. It still takes a lot of courage to be in that space, right? And those allies can help us by really saying the words that need to be said.
Just as we sort of beginning to wind down, I would really like us to, I think we maybe have another question here, so let's see. Yeah, so somebody is saying, I wonder if anybody has thoughts about punditry and contributors and these false equivalent stories. How do you balance being able to talk about underrepresented groups and issues that affect them, with also not wanting to go in and be spoken over, harassed, unable to talk about more nuance, as that is mentioned by Talat?
I'd love to chat about that. You know, when you talk about being overspoken, and actually Talat had also spoken about being the problematic woman of color, right? The person with the power is the person who doesn't stop speaking. So when you hear men overspeak, usually the other person stops speaking and gives them the floor. Have the courage to be the problematic woman of color, and just keep going. Just keep talking. With few exceptions, usually they will stop, especially when you have your facts in order, especially if you can keep your composure, especially if you can continue along the line of discussion that you would like. You've seen many times politicians, or even in entertainment, where women may have to stop and say, you know, I've given you time to speak, I'd like to speak, or whatever, but you don't even need to do that. If you keep talking, which is my tactic, and it's very effective. And it's also painful. It's hard when someone is trying to overspeak you, and we've been taught to be polite. We've been taught to give people the floor. But that is rooted in, if you're going to get your turn as well, if you're going to get your opportunity. If you know your opportunity is not coming, take it. Just keep going. And if people were listening to you, they typically will continue listening to you, and you don't have to overspeak the other person, because it becomes very clear that there's a dynamic there that isn't balanced and isn't warranted. So often that will bring many people to your side of the conversation.
That's really interesting.
So I've had a couple of experiences of this, right? I remember it was during the independence referendum, and I remember being on radio, and it was pretty extraordinary, actually, right? So I was somebody who will remain nameless. Maybe I'll see how I feel. He went on for quite some time, and I was looking to interject. Now, bear in mind, a radio panel, you're looking at, if you're lucky, 10 minutes, right? So you want to say something, you've got to go ahead and say it. And he actually stopped and went, I'm going to finish. He said, well, you're not meant to interrupt. That's not how debating works, sweetie. on national radio. And I went, well, actually, when somebody's continued to make a point and they're becoming incoherent, yes, I think it's okay to interject. And I just like, but it was the entitlement and audacity to say that on national radio and think there are no consequences to that. That's power, that's the privilege, that's everything is speaking there, because they so rarely get interrupted that when they are interrupted, it seems it's aghast, it's offensive to them. And I've only ever been interrupted when I've been in these spaces, right? But so I think I completely hear what Doni's saying there, and I agree. It's the taking up space and unapologetically taking up space that really matters. And also, if you've been called to be there, feeling confident in the fact that your expertise are warranted as much as the other persons on the panel. But I would say that we do need to have a conversation, and I think there needs to be some kind of duty of care within media and within the kind of editing decision-making space about who it is they put you up against. I've had to talk about it was about the experiences of racism and the rise of racism and hate crime against somebody who was formerly of the BNP. And why should I be in that space, and why should those opinions be given parity of esteem as if they are two sides of the argument, when one is a lived experience reality and the other one is hateful rhetoric? Those are not two sides of the same argument. We need to move a conversation on where it's not false equivalence, but it's debate and it's understanding and learning, which would be my experience with somebody who says, actually, I disagree with your method. Why don't we do it this way? I'm happy for somebody to disagree with me. What I'm not okay with is when there is something that is framed as disagreement, but actually it is purposefully delegitimizing a legitimate point. And that's where false equivalent comes in. And that's where there has to be more editorial power used for good.
It's really interesting. See, when you were in that situation, did you feel it saying to like the producers, really? Are you really serious about this? I mean, did you challenge them?
So this was earlier in my, so this is 2014. I hadn't done that much commentary at that stage. I did talk to the person afterwards and the other man that was on the panel, and I did say that wasn't okay. And also, it's not okay to stay silent. You know, you could have interjected. Didn't talk to the producers, but the next time they got in touch to ask me to do something, I pointed out that happened last time. Will there be assurances that won't happen again? So the responsibility goes back to the organisation.
Which I think they've got a lot of responsibility. Great, thank you so much, Talat. Can I just
make a quick suggestion? I think one suggestion to have the courage when you're in those spaces and very big audiences and many people in your career field or just in general having eyes on you is to practice it every day. I just told a story the other day about being at a sales counter speaking with a woman who was across the counter from me, and a man of color, came up and literally started talking to her as if I weren't there. And I stopped and I looked at him and I said, "Excuse me, I'm speaking." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt." And I said, "Yes, you did, or you wouldn't have." And he stopped dead in his shoes, and the woman, she looked so uncomfortable, right? You know, and often, and I'll tell you, often the clerk in that situation, because it does happen often, may then go to help the other person, right? And I make sure that, no, we were speaking, we need to finish our conversation. The men usually often then realize what they were doing. Sometimes they are embarrassed, sometimes they apologize, whatever the case may be. But my point with giving this example is it's a small way with just 3 people where you can exercise that voice, and it gives you strength over time to then exercise it in the big spaces.
Yeah, great. I think that's a really good point to end on, actually, Doni. Because the word that we've used a lot today, and I think the word I would probably apply to all of the women that have spoken today is courage. I think to go into this field and raise your head above the parapet and say, we need change, we demand change. I think it takes lots of courage. And I know personally, having worked with almost everybody in this panel at some point, you are amongst the most courageous women I've ever come across, and you are an inspiration. And today has just been, I hope for the audience, they've found it enjoyable, informative, thought-provoking, but ultimately inspirational, and that each of us can take away a bit more courage, because actually we know that everybody in this virtual room at the moment is standing behind us saying, we're going to support you. So thank you so much. So thank you for your time today, for our audience. So thank you, Doni, because we know it's early morning for you, and we hope to see you in Scotland in person sometime. I can personally attest that Doni was phenomenal at Magazine Street. So if she comes back, you should come and hear her. Thanks to Joe, Zero Tolerance does amazing work. To Talat, who I think actually, Talat, we're going to eventually probably start prefacing your name with National Treasure, because the work that you do is just, it's uplifting, it's necessary, and it's just that you are just the voice we need to hear. To Karen, because a lot of the work that she does in the world of the academy has impact outside, and it makes us stop and it makes us think. To Nikki, for generally just being so supportive, and for also raising this issue in a world, the world of magazines that we know needs a lot of balance in it too, and just for being a really strong voice. To Miranda, for again leading EMCC in such a creative and enthusiastic way, and for bringing us all together today. It's been really great to have this conversation, and it will be great that it's going to appear on the website and more people, and we can share it widely and more people can hear it. So thank you so much to everyone for being here. It was lovely to see you. And I suppose we could say have a good Christmas, because it's almost here. So thank you so much.